So with that, I'm going to go ahead and bring on our presenters for today. Jennifer Lehman is the President and CEO of Mission Advancement, and Lynne McLean, CEO of Children's Advocacy Center of Collin County, Texas. Thank you guys for joining us today.
All right. Thank you, Shannon. And hello, Lynn. We're here in our virtual world, and I'm so excited to bring you this conversation. I've been looking forward to this since the day we planned it and put it on the calendar, because this project has been just a joy to be a part of and to watch and, just help engage over the last several years. And, I've been doing this for 25 years now. And, there's a handful of engagements throughout my career that I would look at as just sort of the most satisfying, the most exciting. And this is going to be one of those sort of pinnacle projects that I'm sure I'll be talking about for a long time. So today's conversation with Lynn is going to be all about what her role looked like in the campaign journey from the very beginning until the end. My goal is that you will take away some nugget that will help you think about maybe an upcoming project, maybe a project that you're in today, whether you're a board member, a CEO, or a development professional. There's going to be something in this conversation today that I really believe will inspire you or help you think a little differently about how your campaign may be structured. So before we begin, I just want Lynn to say a few words about herself and her background and what led her to the Advocacy Center.
Well, sure. Thank you so much, Jennifer,
Lynn,
for inviting me. Can you hear me now? Thank you so much.
Yep, you're good now.
For inviting me to do this. It's such an honor, and it was an exciting project for us to work on together, which we'll get into. So I am a social worker. I have a master's degree in social work. I actually started my career working for Child Protective Services many moons ago. I've worked in the field of child abuse for more than 35 years. After I worked for CPS for 14 years and then moved to the nonprofit side and worked in Child and Family Guidance Center, and then for Community Partners and Greater Texas Community Partners as executive director. Those were fairly small organizations that helped children served by the CPS system. And I have had the privilege of being here as the CEO of the Children's Advocacy Center for almost 12 years. So May 1st will be 12 years. Best job I've ever had. Absolutely love it.
Awesome. Great. Well, we're going to dig right in because I don't want to lose a moment. And as Shannon said, we are planning to leave time for some questions. So I'll be carefully watching our time to make sure we do have some opportunity to hopefully field some of what's on your mind, but you're welcome to send those throughout the webinar today. And Shannon will be collecting those so that we can answer as many as possible at the end. So I'm going to start off by just kind of acknowledging what we hear most commonly from CEOs about what makes a capital campaign challenging from their point of view. First is, do we have the right plan or the right case? Are we raising money for the right project? Second is probably one of the most common is, how do we protect our annual fund? How do you raise millions of dollars for an extraordinary project while you're also raising money for your operational funding? We're going to really describe in detail how that worked with Lynn's project in particular. Another common one is, how do I get my board engaged and what is their role in a campaign? And Lynn will be telling her stories about that. What kind of time do I need to commit? What is my role in terms of execution of the campaign? And what about the disruption of normal business, which still continues while the campaign is going on? How do I use volunteers? What's the role of volunteers in a campaign? And how do I share the load, if you will, with some key leaders? And then, of course, there's this risk of failure concern. And so throughout the conversation today, all of these are going to be addressed at some level. And again, Lynn's stories and experience, I think, are going to really be inspirational to everybody. So I'm going to get right in. We're going to just outline 6 areas that we see as the most critical for campaign readiness or success. And then I'm going to ask Lynn to speak to each one of them in terms of how this played out in her specific project. So the first is a compelling or an urgent need. How do we know that we have the right project? So when we think about what makes a case compelling, essentially we ask the question, what changes lives for the good? And in most cases, your organization is dealing with people, students, people in the community at some level. So what it's not about is the buildings or whatever the project may be accomplishing. It's not about the program, it's not about construction, it's not about expanding facilities. It's what happens because of those extraordinary projects. So what happens inside the buildings or what happens with the new programs that you may be launching. That's what we always want to be looking for when it comes to building a compelling or an urgent case for a campaign. So I want Lynn to talk a little bit about what their story was and the need and how we kind of crafted that into a compelling case. Go ahead.
Sure. So the compelling need for us was the projected growth in Collin County. We offer services to 100% of children who are impacted by abuse or neglect in our county. And we were becoming increasingly concerned about how we were going to be able to keep doing that given the projected growth in Collin County. Collin County is one of the fastest growing counties in the nation. And so we were worried about that. So the need was not urgent in that we were not out of space. We were not turning children away, but it was compelling because with the growth, if we didn't add an additional facility, we would have to eventually start turning children away. So that was our compelling story.
Absolutely. So yeah, you guys were a little unusual in this way that even before we began conversations about a feasibility study, you already had, what do you call it, a permanent site committee?
We had a site task force, yes.
Right. So there was already a lot of discussion going on internally about how are we going to manage the growth that we know is coming that's going to affect our ability to serve more children. So it was a little different in that way. A lot of organizations are faced with something extremely urgent and time sensitive, but it doesn't necessarily make your case less compelling. It just was a more forward-looking kind of need that we were trying to solve. Okay, so we're going to get into more details around that as we talk about some of these other pieces, but I want to move straight to the board because this is definitely a topic that is a hot one with a lot of CEOs. And how do you get a board engaged in a campaign? What is their role in a campaign? And I'll tell you from our perspective as council, this is a really key piece of campaign success. So a lot of organizations, you know, we'll come in and talk to them about doing a campaign or raising money, and the board will say, at some level, they'll say something like, we're not a fundraising board. And we always say, oh, but you are. You may not think you're a fundraising board. You are a fundraising board. And that doesn't mean that you as a board member are pounding the pavement asking for money. But as a board member, you do have some ownership and responsibility around the revenue side of the organization, which probably includes a philanthropy component. So helping a board member understand what their role is and what you expect in terms of a fundraising campaign or even annual fund is a really common question and a common challenge. So here's how we like to frame that. When in a campaign specifically, we want to know, does the board agree with the need? So in Lynn's example, the need is we're going to need to expand capacity. That's the need. Secondly, do they agree with the plan? So that plan could be, you can accomplish this in a number of ways. And Lynn's going to talk a little bit about how they navigated that decision. But the board not only needs to agree that, yes, we have a need, we're going to run out of space at some point, and B, the plan that we have in place is a good plan or the right plan for us. Are they willing to give? This is always a key factor. The answer needs to be yes. And Lynn's going to talk a little bit about how they went about doing this. And do they represent stable and strong leadership? Really, you know, for a period of time. you know, Lynn's journey lasted several years from beginning to end. So she went through multiple board presidents and, you know, executive committees during that time, and having consistently strong leadership that was on the same page with what they needed to do was critically important for the campaign to continue to make progress. So the bottom line is, what I like to say to organizations is, at a minimum, board members must be willing to set the example and do what you are asking others to do. To me, that's the simplest way to frame it. And when we think about how a campaign typically plays out, I like to describe it as concentric circles. That you normally start with those who are closest to the organization, meaning the board and other donors who know you well. And over time, you move out to those wider circles of donors who may be less connected, but still be potential investors in a campaign. And what those donors many times will ask is, how much is the board giving? Is the board 100% in? Because their expectation is that the board would not ask others to do something they haven't done themselves. So that's the simplest way that I've learned to frame it. And that applies, by the way, to your annual fund as much as it does to a campaign. So I want Lynn to talk a little bit more about what her board looked like, how the process was of getting them in agreement, and a few other kind of anecdotal stories.
So I'll share some things about that. So our board was really engaged every step of the way about the reasons we were exploring this, what the center needed to do, and why we needed to do it. It was critical that we had board engagement in order for this project to be successful. But since our project was not urgent, that meant that we had some time to look at what the options were and to study the issues. It also meant that we needed to come up with a compelling case for why this needed to be done, because we couldn't say, if we don't do this, children won't be served right now, right? So we had to develop a really compelling case. So as you said earlier, we established a task force made up of board members to gather data and study this whole issue. And they met for a couple of years. I mean, it took a long time. And we kept the full board informed about our progress, what we were learning, what the data was telling us. We knew, as I said, their buy-in was critical from the beginning. And as you said, this went on for several years. So I changed, board presidents changed during that time. And it was important that the board president set the standard in terms of belief in this project, and that as we oriented new board members who joined the board during this time, that we folded it into board orientation, that this is what we were looking at and why, so that we kept everyone informed every step of the way. And then I want to address your issue about the board members setting an example and doing what they're asking others to do. We took that very seriously. We solicited, as you said, concentric circles. We solicited our board and advisory council members before we ever asked a community donor to give. So we focused on them first, and we have a board of 30. So it was a lot. I mean, it was a lot. But we actually, my board president and I met with each board member and their spouse individually, one-on-one, and went through all of the data and the reasons for the project, what the difference was going to make for our community and our children. And then we made a specific ask of each board member, a specific amount that we wanted them to contribute to the campaign. Now, the amount varied depending on the board members' capacity to give, because we knew these board members and we knew that, so the amount varied, but we did ask for a specific amount. And it was very successful. And I am convinced that the board ended up giving much more with this one-on-one relational approach. We often met them in their own home. My board president and I would go to their home and meet with the board member and their spouse. That taking that approach was much more successful than if I had announced at a board meeting that everyone needs to give to the capital campaign, pull out your checkbook, right? Because we gave them something to shoot for. We would tell them how much we needed, and they were part of something really big. And so they stepped up. It worked really well.
That's awesome. I love that story. And I know, just anecdotally, you had a couple board members that stretched and gave more than they thought they would, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I was going to get to that later, but I can say it now. You know, one of the things that I was scared about was asking people for specific amounts of money, because that was one of the things I was scared about. And there was one particular board member that I remember that I was meeting with him and his wife, and I asked him for $100,000 contribution to the campaign. And he looked at me and he said, well, Lynn, I was thinking 50,000. And I said, okay, whatever's meaningful to you is meaningful to us. So whatever you decide to do is good. And he said, but let me talk with Kelly. Kelly and I will talk about it and we'll decide, what we're able to do, and I'll get back to you. I was like, okay. So, and ultimately he came back and they gave $100,000. And so it's like I set their sights higher and they were able to do more than they initially planned to do. So asking for that specific amount really helped them stretch a little bit, I think. And they felt really good about it too. They were really pleased with being able to make a contribution in that amount. So that's just one example of it.
Yes. So this was a hugely successful piece of the campaign, and we're going to talk a little bit later about leadership and how this became an even more important component of the campaign. One of the tips that I like to give around how to do this with a board, if you're sitting back thinking my board would never agree to this or that feels too cumbersome, is to say to the board, let us practice on you. If the board is coming in early, which hopefully they are, then a lot of times you feel like you already know them, you have existing relationships. They'll say, oh, I don't need the meeting. You don't need to do that for me. Save that for somebody else. But as a CEO in particular, if this is something that's relatively new and you're learning to kind of find your words, they're the perfect group to practice on. And so I found that to be a successful way to kind of talk a board member into it, if you will, that A, you want them to experience what other donors are going to experience, and B, that you are looking for a friendly place to start. So asking a familiar face to kind of allow you to practice with them is sometimes a way that not only can you have a really successful meeting, but you as a CEO or a leader can really begin to kind of find what's comfortable for you in how you talk about the project, and set you up for all your later meetings. So
can I add something to what you just said? And that is that was you told me that when I started this, and that was exactly the approach I took. And it did make it easier for me to eventually approach community donors, because I had done the presentation a number of times for board members. And I did the same, even though board members knew about this project and knew why we were doing it, I covered everything from the beginning to end with every board member in the same way I did with donors that were just learning about the project. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's a great way to practice. And like Lynn said, her board, like every board, is diverse in terms of capacity. So this is not a board of all 7-figure donors. There were many who were $5,000 donors over a period of time. So there was a lot of diversity, but every board member was given the same kind of audience and attention, and every gift was meaningful. So highly encourage you, as you think about a project you may be launching, to think about that kind of approach. The one-to-many, like Lynn said, in a board meeting, the pass the hat kind of approach will not yield anywhere close to what you can get if you kind of take the time and build those relationships individually. Okay, so the next piece is evidence of donor interest. So clearly there's got to be some capacity outside of the board to meet your goal. And so what I want to talk about here is what that means in terms of feasibility study, because typically this is where that conversation sort of begins, is we learn about that through a feasibility process, which Lynn did do. So I want to say just a couple things about feasibility studies and then have her talk about how theirs played out. So first of all, why do you do a feasibility study? The way we see it is there's 2 really big buckets of reasons why you would do it. First is, do you have options or a go, no-go decision? So in Lynn's case, this was true. They were exploring an option. They weren't running out of space right away. So they really didn't have the urgency of we have to do something now. It was, we have a couple of different ways we could approach this, and they were really looking for that feedback and input about whether they should proceed. The other is a donor cultivation and engagement element, which is a part of a feasibility study no matter what. And sometimes, even if you know you're going to campaign, having that initial step of donor cultivation and kind of getting their buy-in early can be really valuable. So what does a study not do? A study will not predict the future. There is no possible way for a study to tell you everything that will play out throughout a campaign. It will not uncover all of the available resources. You know, it's a moment in time kind of study of leadership, essentially, those who you believe could have a significant impact, but you will uncover resources throughout the life of the campaign. And Lynn's got a couple of examples of that as well. And it's never going to mitigate all the risk. You know, campaigning is risky, and there's no way that you can mitigate every single pitfall that you may encounter. You know, Lynn's going to talk about the fact that her campaign was just about to wrap up when COVID hit. And, you know, thankfully we were able to navigate that, but there's no chance that you can predict what things are going to look like a year, 2 years, 3 years from now. But there are good reasons for studies. And I want Lynn to talk specifically about kind of what their study was looking at and what the results were and some of the resulting actions that were taken.
Sure, of course. So in our case, the feasibility study was really critical to the success of our campaign. Initially, we weren't sure how or if we should move forward. And so the study really helped inform that process in some really big ways. So the first thing that the study revealed was, and this was really good news, was that our donors were really passionately connected to our mission. They really cared about this cause. They had great belief in the work that we did. They had great trust in the leadership, both the staff and the board, so that the agency was well respected. They felt very good about what we're doing, very good about their connection to us. But they had a number of questions about our initial plan, and they did not support our initial plan, which was really important for us to figure out, obviously. Because initially we had decided that the best plan was for us to sell our current facility and build one big mega center in the middle of Collin County. And that would make everything accessible. It would be less operational expense. There were a number of reasons. We'd keep the team together in one building, that would be the very best option. But they had some questions about that. One question was, how did we know that the location we had selected was the right location for this new facility? They wanted to know why we were selling our current facility when it was paid off and we had no debt. And then they wanted to know when we would max out the space and capacity to serve children in our current building. And we did not have answers to those questions. And so Mission Advancement, I think wisely, advised us to delay launching the capital campaign so that we could gather more data and study these questions. And so we established a permanent site committee. Some of those people had been on the original site task force. We gathered more detailed data. We gathered tons of data, actually, from the Texas State Demographer. We contacted all of the school districts in Collin County to determine what their child population projections would be. We also contacted Collin County. They had a mobility study, so we needed to look at traffic and how that was going to impact accessibility for children to get to our facility. So we used all of that data, and from that we determined that the child population in Collin County was projected to triple between that point and 2050, and that the number of children we would need to be prepared to serve was going to triple as well. And the traffic was going to triple, like everything was going to triple. And we used that to help us figure out how many staff we would need, how much space we would need, and we determined that we would max out capacity to serve children in this building by 2023, which is now just a minute from now. Back then it was like 5 or 6 years off, but by 2023 we would max out capacity to serve children. So ultimately, using all that data, we decided that the best course of action was for us to keep this current facility that is paid off and meets our needs well to serve the southern part of the county, and then to establish a second full-service facility in McKinney to meet the needs of children in the northern part of the county. And that would be accessible to them. It would be full service. It would have everything that we have in this facility. So it would meet all of the need, but it would be more accessible and give us the expanded capacity that we needed. So we had the data to back it up, that that was what we needed to do. So that was really helpful. So the permanent site committee presented all of the data to the board, and the board decided, and unanimously, in fact, decided to launch a capital campaign in January of 2018. Mission Advancement did help us with that presentation in terms of how to present that data. And we made it very clear when they made that decision that we would expect full board participation. Everyone would be expected to give. So they knew that when they unanimously voted. And then when we went back to the donors who had originally given us that feedback in the feasibility study, and we shared our new plan, revised plan based on the data we'd collected, 100% of them were supportive. And so that gave us great confidence, I think, going forward that, okay, now we have a good plan that makes sense. And then there were a couple of other things that happened during the feasibility study that I think are important to mention. And one is that there was one donor that was interviewed by the Mission Advancement consultant during the study who told them that we weren't asking them for enough money. and basically they were donors who supported us through our gala, which is our big special event, but we'd never really asked them for anything else. And so ultimately that donor ended up making $1 million gift to the campaign. And they never would have been on our radar if not for the feasibility study. We never would have really known that. And so that was a wonderful miracle. And then there's the other issue is that when we were getting ready to launch this campaign, we had not decided whether we were going to buy a building and renovate it or whether we were going to buy land and build from the ground up. We knew if we could find a building and renovate it, it would be cheaper, but we didn't know if we could find a building. And so there were all these factors. And I was real nervous. I think all of us were we were nervous about moving forward with that and talking to donors about giving when we hadn't even made a decision about exactly how it was going to work or how we were going to establish this facility. But Mission Advancement advised us to move forward and to start talking to those early donors who are really close to the center and knew our mission well, and just explain that we had to make a decision. We would be making a decision within a certain time frame, but we really wanted their commitment to the campaign. And we had donors give to the campaign before we even had an answer to that question. And then one of the things that happened, it's a really good thing that Mission Advancement advised us to do that, because one of those early donors ended up being a person who had the perfect piece of land for our facility. And he ultimately ended up making a $1 million land donation to the center. And we would not, if we had waited and made our decision first, we wouldn't have known that that land existed. And he felt very good about, oh my gosh, I happen to have this land that's specifically where you need it, that meets your need. And so while we were nervous about not having our plan fully developed, we went forward anyway, and it worked out okay.
Yeah. I love this piece of your story because so many organizations believe they have to have every single answer tied up in a really nice package before they even think about launching the very early stages of a campaign. And so being able to tell this story and share this with other organizations, I think is really inspirational, especially because of the land gift that I know I saw your budget. You had a budget for buy land and build, and you had a budget for buy an existing building and renovate. And you were actively pursuing both options and telling donors that we are actively pursuing both options. And through those conversations, this donor said, well, if land is an option, I might have something that would work. Because you knew where you wanted to be. You knew what part of town you wanted to be in. It was a very specific, radius.
Specific area. Yes, exactly. So.
Yep. And the campaign process, as you know, Lynn, but others may not, have experienced, it is a courtship. It is a multiple meeting kind of process with your best supporters or those that have the capacity to be your best supporters. So it's not a one and done meeting. And so those early meetings that you were having in those first few months of that very silent part of the campaign were very exploratory and sharing what was happening and why you guys were embarking on this journey. And through those early dialogues, you were able to find this amazing opportunity. You didn't need a brochure. You didn't need a video or any fancy collateral to be able to go and have those very transparent, genuine conversations with folks that you knew could move the needle if they really wanted to.
Yeah, it's absolutely right. And those donors that the donor that ended up giving $1 million and the one who ended up giving the land valued at $1 million, both of those donors I had met with multiple times before we ever asked for anything from them. And they were ready by the time I asked them. They were ready, I think, to be part of it. And so there was something else I was going to say, and now I can't remember what it was, but it really is a courtship process, and it really does. It takes time,
Yeah. Well, it really is relationship building. I remember the courtship process with the $1 million donor, and it was just really getting to know them as a couple.
It was
understanding what they cared about. Yeah. And by the time you got to that 7-figure ask, it wasn't uncomfortable. It felt like they were ready and you were ready, and they kind of knew that this was coming and something they would seriously consider. So love it. Okay, well, let's get to our next topic, because I know this is a key piece for a lot of organizations, and that's how to protect your annual fund. A lot of organizations think this is impossible. It's not, and our approach specifically in campaigns is very tied to this notion of keeping annual and capital separate. And I say that because I know there are other ways to do campaigns that I might call a comprehensive campaign. And that's where you put everything together in one bucket and you say, we're going to raise our annual budget and this extraordinary amount, and we're going to just count everything over the next 3 to 5 years. Our approach separates those two and helps donors understand the difference in operational funding gifts versus extraordinary capital gifts. But clearly we have to be able to find, the capacity for that over and above fundraising while we sustain and probably have a growth path in place. And, in Lynn's case, this was definitely opening a second facility. We had to have a plan for how operations were going to grow. And by the time they were in the new facility, they needed to be close to $1 million a year larger. I think it was 800,000, if I recall, on an annual basis. And so 2 very simultaneous strategies that had to be happening. And most importantly is avoiding what we like to call substitutionary giving, which is simply a donor saying, sure, I'll give you that capital gift, but then they don't give an annual gift. And so your operational funding suffers a little bit throughout the campaign period, which hopefully we can help you avoid. So the way we like to describe this very simply, we kind of call that our perfect campaign is to have a strategy to meet the extraordinary needs while also having a separate strategy that's protecting the annual fund and looking at the future needs of the organization. So Lynn, talk a little bit about how that played out for you guys and your team and the myriad of things that happened on that front.
Yeah, absolutely. So Mission Advancement did an assessment of our development department and our fundraising strategies as part of their planning study process. And from that, we learned a lot. I mean, we learned we were doing a lot of things right, but we also learned that we were not maximizing the capacity of the donors in our current donor base. What they told us was that we could more than double the amount of operational funds we were raising with our current donors without ever adding another donor if we basically had a more strategic way of interacting with our donors. And so we implemented the donor portfolio management strategy. We identified the top 100 donors to the center. We assigned them to a portfolio of either me or one of the development team. And then we worked to develop deeper individual relationships with those donors and to become more relational in how we were approaching them in terms of their giving. We talked with them about what they truly cared about. What was it about our mission that was most compelling to them? And then we learned to be able to craft the asks that we made based on what was most meaningful to that particular donor. And so as a result, our annual giving actually grew by leaps and bounds throughout the capital campaign. We exceeded our net income to budget every year that this campaign was going on. And we also, as Jennifer said, we had to develop an annual growth plan because our budget, by adding another facility, our budget was going to grow by about $800,000. So we had to develop a strategy for how we were going to not just keep our current operational funding, but ramp up our funding so that when we open this center, we can support it. And we are right now on track to meet those numbers. We've been working on that over the last couple of years. So it's been a longer term process, but it's been working really well. The other thing that we did was that we made it very clear to every single capital campaign donor that we had to protect our operating funds while we were raising these capital campaign funds, and that the capital campaign gift needed to be above and beyond what they were already giving operationally. And this was really successful. You could, when I would say that to a donor, you could almost see a bell go off in their head and they would go, oh yeah, of course, you have to protect your operating funds. And they would say, well, we normally give you $10,000 a year. So we need to, we'll make sure we continue to do that. And then we'll think about this gift above and beyond that. And every donor seemed to really understand that. And we did not see a drop in operational funding during the capital campaign. And Jennifer knows that was actually one of the things I was most frightened about. I did not know how we were going to raise $10 million in cash and still support our operating budget at the same time. I just didn't know how we were going to be able to do it, but yeah, we did. So
but you did. Yep. And that's, part of the approach that I think makes that possible is that you work so one-to-one with donors. I think the campaigns that really suffer the most when it comes to operational funding is when you go one-to-many, meaning you ask a group of people, or you're at an event, you're at some other, just like the board, right? It's the same kind of example. When you sit with a donor one-to-one, you can have that intentional conversation. When you say it in a room with 30 people or 300 people, it's going to be lost on most of them. So the one-to-one approach, I think, really makes that an easier conversation and ones that donors appreciate the transparency and certainly understand, why it's important that those operational gifts continue. Okay, I'm going to move on to leadership because this is one of my favorite topics, and I don't want to run out of time to get through it all. So, top flight leadership in our campaign model is critically important to the success, and especially when you think about the role of the CEO. I think Lynn will attest to this, how important having a strong leadership team was to not just support her, but really carry a lot of the burden in terms of driving the campaign. So what is the secret to successful leadership? From our perspective, it's truly the manner in which that team is built. So of course it's identifying the right people, but once you've identified the right people, how they are asked to serve, in my experience, has a lot to do with how they eventually perform. So if it's a phone call that says, hey, will you serve on this committee? Sure, great, and that's it, then you're much more likely to get less involvement and commitment than if you walk through a very intentional and personal process. So I want Lynn to talk more about her leadership team, how we kind of identified and enlisted the group that ultimately led the campaign with her.
Okay, sure. So I knew who I wanted to chair our capital campaign the minute we launched it. When Jennifer knows this, we had a couple that had been connected to the center since 2012. The husband had previously been a board member and had been my board president at one time. The wife had chaired our annual gala a number of times. And so they were both deeply invested in our mission. And so I started off just by meeting with them one-on-one. I had 2 or 3 meetings with them, just talking about the data and the campaign and what's going on at the center, and keeping them informed and keeping them connected to what we were doing and what our future plans were, and then slowly sharing more and more about the campaign. And then I met with them and asked them to chair the campaign. And I told them that I didn't need the answer today. Like, we would be so honored if you would take this on and how much it would mean, but I don't have to have the answer today. And the husband of the couple looked at me and said, well, it's a really good thing that you don't need the answer today, because if you wanted the answer today, the answer would be no. And he's a businessman, and he had a number of questions that he wanted answered before he would commit to this campaign. So he wanted to know how committed the board was to the campaign. He wanted to know what my plans were, if I was planning to retire or move on to another organization or anything. He wanted to know how we were going to raise the operational funds to support 2 facilities, because he knew that was a big issue. So we worked with Jennifer. We prepared a strategic fundraising plan for how we were going to get to that number that we needed to support 2 facilities. We shared that with them. They continued to ask questions. We continued to answer questions. They reached out to the board president about what the level of board commitment was to this project. They really were not going to take on a project that they didn't believe could be successful. So ultimately, it took them 4 months to decide. Jennifer and I were on pins and needles for 4 months, but they did agree to chair. And I knew that once they agreed, they'd be in with both feet, and they were. I mean, from the very beginning, they were in with both feet. So once they were in, then actually putting together the rest of the campaign leadership team was fairly easy. We asked members who were on the permanent site committee, who already knew the plan, knew the data, and believed in the project, to be part of this. But even then, and I'm just remembering this now, Jennifer, it's been a while back, we didn't just call those people up. We did a proposal to them, asking them to serve on the campaign leadership team. Mark and I met with them either by phone or in person to invite them to be part of this campaign leadership team. So even though they knew this project, we were very formal in how we invited people to be part of it. And I think ultimately people knew they were taking on a big responsibility, and that they were ready for it. It's like, okay, I get to be part of this. So I think they were kind of honored to be invited, because we really did it as an invitation. And so we ultimately ended up with the chairs, the husband-wife couple, 4 board members, and 1 advisory council member. So we were really a pretty small group. We met monthly for 18 months, and we met in person back then when you could. We actually met in person, and because we were a small group, it was pretty easy to get it on everyone's calendars and get everyone in the room. So I think that was really helpful to have that small group. And one example of the level of commitment of this capital campaign chair is that when we had those meetings, he led them. I didn't. He would meet with the capital campaign consultant at Mission Advancement, and sometimes with me, and we would talk through the agenda and what were the outstanding items and what were our next steps. But he led the conversations, he led the meetings, he did the assignments to board members in terms of who they were going to solicit, and he held people accountable. And I think that's one of the things that made our project successful, was that it wasn't me, it was coming from him. So
yeah. 100%. I mean, I remember waiting, to get their answer, and it was a lot. It was, it's frustrating because you want to keep going and keep making progress. But we both believed, the whole team believed, that if we could get a yes, that it would probably change the trajectory of the project, because we knew they would seriously take that role and own it. And no question that they were powerful, not in their personal influence as much as their leadership by example, and just being very clear from the beginning that this is going to be successful and we're all going to do our part. And they were the people holding everybody accountable throughout the campaign. So it was worth the wait in the end.
It was.
Worth it. Okay, so the last element is time. And we're going to talk a little bit about Lynn's role, but we're also going to talk about what a campaign timeline typically looks like. So this is a really simple graphic and how we look at how much time a capital campaign typically takes. Now, some of you may be looking at, much smaller and more, very focused efforts, which could be shortened a little bit. So just know that this is a very generic kind of way to describe how you might look at a campaign. But if you're going to be breaking ground, let's just say in 2023, if that's your desire, then we would back it up something like this and say you might have a community or a public phase element that might be 4 months or so. Your silent phase, for a capital campaign like Lynn's, I would say at least a year, and really probably that 15-month is closer to accurate, where you're doing those individual meetings and soliciting the board, your top 30 sources essentially, which gets you the vast majority of the way there. And then there's that organizational piece, which is when you're creating that story, identifying your leaders, getting all those enlisted, and looking at the prospect pool and really developing the financial path forward. Before that, you might do a study. So you can see how a study definitely adds time to a campaign. And so if you're in a situation where a campaign is inevitable and you know that you have to move at some level, that study work can many times be worked into that campaign organization phase, and you can just begin moving. So for some organizations, that makes more sense. So we like to talk about kind of a 2-year, 24-month from organization to a public phase kind of time frame for a campaign. That's usually pretty reasonable for an organization like Lynn's or of similar size. So Lynn, tell us a little bit about how that compared with your timeline, and then of course COVID happened, and how did that impact how we finished out?
Yeah, so we were rocking along really nicely there. We'd been raising funds. We had the vast amount of the money raised, I guess about 25 months or so that we'd been working on it from a standing start to then. We were planning to go public with the campaign in April of 2020. And of course, COVID hit in March and I panicked. I had no idea what we were going to do. And so what we did initially was to be very intentional about staying in contact with the capital campaign donors who had already committed to the campaign. So, I mean, I reached out to every one of them, some of them more than once, and kept them informed about what we were doing for children during the COVID crisis, what was going on at the center, let them know that this campaign would go forward, but that we were not making asks right then. So I was very intentional about keeping that communication. And then once we all got acclimated to life under COVID, when we kind of figured out this wasn't going to go away in 3 months or 4 months, I started reaching out to donors that were still on our list and asked if they'd meet with me on Zoom. And they did. They were more than willing to meet with me on Zoom. And I shared all the data, learned how to screen share and all those things we've had to learn since then. And did the same presentation I did with people in person. And I think it was about 6 or 7 people that I met with, and every one of them made a commitment to the campaign by Zoom, which was pretty astounding. But my favorite was the last gift. I think it's Jennifer's favorite too. I was meeting with 2 sisters who had given to the center for a number of years, largely through our special event, our big gala. They'd never made a 6-figure gift before. They did know about the capital campaign because I'd met with one of the sisters about a year before and told her what was going on in terms of our future expansion. And they agreed to meet with me by Zoom. So I met with them and I made a large ask of them. What I didn't know was that they had gotten together before the meeting and already decided what they were going to give, and that it was twice as much as what I had asked for. And so when they told me how much they were giving, I started to cry because it was the amount that took us over the top of our $10 million cash goal. And I was profusely grateful, as you can imagine. I was very emotional. And one of the sisters looked at me and said, "Thank you for asking. We are so grateful that we had the opportunity to be part of this." And that just made me cry even more, that it was that they were grateful that they were able to be part of it. So that was huge. So so ultimately in December of 2020, during a pandemic, we completed raising $10 million to build our new facility, and that was a happy day.
Yeah. It was a very happy day. I remember well that phone call and celebrating with you virtually, and then having a lovely little outdoor celebration with masks and all, with a bunch of key donors out at the new property. And it was just a fantastic celebratory time, even despite, you know, all the challenges that everybody was facing in the midst of it. But yeah, I've shared that story with other organizations and with my team, because what I love about that gift, it was how thankful the donor was that Lynn asked. And, you know, I think a lot of people, especially during COVID, have been gun shy about, should we ask? Is it appropriate to ask? You know, it doesn't feel like the right time. And what that experience, you know, just solidified is there are people who are generous and want to be generous. And not everybody is able to give, or it's the right time for everybody, but for those who are and want to do it, it was so joyous to them to have the opportunity that they were grateful to Lynn. So not only was it the pinnacle gift that put us over our goal, but it was probably one of the more kind of emotional and gratifying, I would say, meetings that I know that you had. Okay, so in the interest of time, Lynn, I'm just going to ask you one final question, and then we're going to move on to hopefully a little bit of Q&A. I wish we had another hour, but just tell us quickly what your primary role was from your point of view during the campaign.
Yeah, so my primary role was really telling the compelling story of why we needed this facility and how it would change the lives of children. I was part of the vast majority of the solicitations, meeting with the donors, but I always had a campaign leadership team member, board member, or leadership team member there with me. We would decide before we went to meet with the donor who was going to make the actual ask based on who had the closest relationship. But my primary job was to tell the story. The other thing I think that's important is that my vice president of development was not involved in the capital campaign. She was focused on operational funding. That's where I wanted her to be, was focused on operational funding. So now we did stay in close communication to make sure that both of us weren't going to the same donor for a gala sponsorship and a capital campaign gift. So we communicated, and she knew what was going on with the campaign, but she was not responsible for raising the capital campaign funds. I was. And it was really helpful to have those roles delineated, I think, because she could focus on growing our operational funding. And then I was also really fortunate to have a really strong leadership team that could handle the operations of the center while I was focused on the capital campaign, because it does take a lot of time.
Yeah. Yeah, so back to that original kind of, you know, common question about, you know, how do I allocate my time? How much of my time is taken? I like to say that a capital campaign lives in the CEO's office. You know, that may look very different for different organizations, depending on the size of the staff and capacity of staff. But at the end of the day, those top donors probably want to see the CEO. So the development team or person or whatever, you know, maybe in your situation, needs to stay focused on operational funding. And you as the CEO are probably going to be heavily involved, at least in the top 10 to 15 kind of donor meetings, and perhaps more, depending on the donor base. Okay, I've got more slides, but we are running out of time, and I do want to get to some questions. So we were going to talk a little more about fears and advice and a couple other things, even the role of counsel, but you will get the slides if you are, you know, tuning in, so you'll be able to kind of work through those. But Shannon, let us know what we can answer today.
Absolutely. So Lynn, first of all, thank you for joining us today. And I just want to say, if anyone has any questions, go ahead and put those in the questions panel. Like Jennifer said, we'll try and get to as many of those as possible. Lynn, I bet as you were studying to be a social worker and then start out your career, you never thought that you would be doing a 6 or 7 figure ask. Did you?
Never. I didn't have any idea I'd ever be the CEO of anything. I had no aspirations to do that. It just sort of happened that way. No, I just wanted to be a social worker. That's all. To help people.
Well, thank you. You did an awesome job. And so our first question is from Dan, and he wants to go back to the board members and the solicitation of board members. And what about board members who are fully committed to the mission but might not have the capacity to contribute? Jennifer, how would you handle that?
Yeah, well, I think like Lynn described, and her board is diverse. The nature of the Advocacy Center, there's even some board positions that are sort of municipal leaders. The county sheriff and others like that are a part of the board, and so that's right. Yep. So we, just like every donor, we looked at every board member as a prospect, and some had great capacity, some did not. But Lynn, why don't you give an example maybe of one of the board members that was a smaller donor?
Yeah, I mean, probably the best example is the fact that we do have statutory partners on our board, and one of those partners, we needed to have 100% giving. It was really important, and so she ended up giving $100, and so it was like that was a gift. She gave to the campaign, and we were able to do that. As you said earlier, I had someone who gave $2,000, and then I had some that did $5,000 over time, and then some that did far more than that. But it was all over the map in terms of the amount of giving, but we approached each one of them the same, and I met with each one of them. Yeah.
Great. So I have two more, and so that might take us a little over time. So Doug is asking, concerning the projection of the annual funding, is it ever a good idea to designate a percentage of each capital campaign gift as a percentage of operating funds? So Jennifer, that kind of gets to that whole comprehensive campaign.
Yeah. I don't want to say it's never a good idea, because without knowing the circumstances, I think there's always good creative solutions. But I think, the way we described kind of asking the donor for both is in my view, kind of the ideal. So if a donor, let's just say, gives you $5,000 a year and you're asking for 20, I mean, I would probably rather frame it as, we'd like to ask you to continue that $5,000 directly to operations, but then consider a $20,000 pledge specifically to the capital campaign. I think just the clarity of keeping those separate is helpful to the donor, because you're going to want to come back to them year after year for operating. And if you do one ask and say, oh, a percentage goes here and a percentage goes there, it just kind of, I think, might confuse in the eyes of a donor how you want them to continue contributing to the annual operating budget on a regular basis. So that's my thought, is that keeping them separate is better in the donor's eyes. But there's always good creative solutions, so I wouldn't say that would be completely off the table.
Okay. And so, Lynn, I know that you mentioned this at the end about your development staff being primarily focused on the annual giving portion. Can you give us a little bit more clarity as far as, so Jason's asking, how big was your development staff? Were they all focused on annual giving, et cetera?
I have a fairly, I think Jennifer would say, robust development team. I have a special event manager and a donor relations manager, a corporate relations manager, and then I have a grants writer and someone who handles the donor database. But the people that were focused on the annual giving were the donor relations manager, the corporate relations manager, and the vice president of development. So it was those three people that were focused on annual giving and that had a portfolio, and those portfolios have continued to evolve over these last couple of years in terms of people being added and taken off. We have a whole new strategy in terms, probably going on too long, but in terms of when new donors come in, that they're immediately assigned to someone so that we can follow up with them. So we have a whole, and when we have special events, we have a whole strategy for how we engage those people and supporting the center beyond the special event. So it had like several different components of how we have continued to build our annual giving. I don't know if you would add anything to that, Jennifer. You worked really closely with our team on that, so.
Yeah, I mean, I just, I always say, a lot of times a board will ask, well, why do we need counsel? We have a development team. And, I always say, well, that's true, but they have a full-time job, and that full-time job is not going away during a campaign. And in Lynn's case, and in many cases, their job is actually growing or changing, because now we got to figure out how to grow this operational budget over the next however many years. And so that's a big task for the team, the leader of the development team, to have to take on. So yeah, I mean, part of our work in a campaign, like I said, is those simultaneous strategies. So while we're driving campaign, we're also working with the development team. And we did work very closely to realign some positions, to reframe some job descriptions, and to do a lot of training and coaching around that portfolio strategy that Lynn mentioned, and actually kind of emulating what was happening with the campaign on more of an annual fund basis, and getting that entire group sort of to embrace the more relational approach. So I would say, if the vice president of development was here, she'd probably say, my job was busier than ever, and trying to figure out how to grow that operational funding was more than a full-time job, and staying focused on that and not having the responsibility of making sure the campaign was on track at every turn was a relief to that team. So they were busy.
They were busy. They were, yeah. They're amazing, actually. But
yes, they are.
Well, thank you both for today's session. I think it was very insightful. Lynn, thank you for your time and contribution. I just want to thank everyone for joining today, and we hope to see you on our next session. You will be getting a follow-up email from me with the recording. Please feel free to share it with others who might find this content helpful. And again, if we can help you with anything with regards to growing your annual fund, or if you're looking at a planning study or potential campaign in the future, please reach out to us with any questions. Thank you so much for joining. Bye-bye.